we learn lots of interesting backstory to Beatrice that really helps us understand the rest of her story and the rest of the series here in this episode. For one thing, we learn who Henrietta is, finally. Henrietta is Hollyhock's mother and Bojack's father's mistress. And Henrietta gets pregnant with Hollyhock during this episode. An interesting question to ask is, given how cold and mean Beatrice is during the entire series, and given that Henrietta totally betrayed her by sleeping with her husband, why does Beatrice make this enormous decision to help her, to pay for her schooling? It's an important question, and of course, as always, the show doesn't offer us a single answer, but it seems like ultimately Beatrice's real commitment to not letting another woman's agency over her own life be taken away by men and children and domesticity is what ends up trumping her coldness. She really does, as far as I can tell, she has no ulterior motives for helping Henrietta. There's nothing that she gets out of it, which makes it interesting because she doesn't usually do selfless things, right? It really does seem like she is moved for once by this genuine moral concern that she feels that her own agency over her own life was destroyed by a man and by being tied into the mothering role when she wasn't ready for it and hadn't really chosen it. And she doesn't want to see the same thing happen to Henrietta. In some sense, this is a really morally redeeming scene for Beatrice. We seem to see her doing something genuinely principled and selfless and overcoming her own hurt to help. But in another sense, it's a very bittersweet scene because it takes away any last hope that she's secretly glad that she had Bojack, or that underneath all of her meanness to him, she loves him and is glad that he's part of her life. It really does seem that it's resentment all the way down when it comes to her relationship with Bojack, with nothing redeemable in there. We also learn why she cares so much about the doll. Right? The doll has at least 3 meanings for her. It's the doll that she's attached to now as she's living out her time as an old woman, and it gives her something to care about. But also, it was torn out of her hands when she was a child, and this was a traumatic and formative event for her. And interestingly, it seems like the doll also represents Henrietta's baby and Hollyhock, right? The baby that was taken away. If you notice, when she tears Henrietta's baby out of her hands while Henrietta cries after her, that scene looks and sounds almost exactly the same as the scene where her own doll is torn out of her hands. They're both these moments of trauma through loss. And so her caring for this doll now is a way of repairing that. We also get yet another case where Beatrice appears to genuinely compliment Bojack and to have a moment of connection with him, but it's based on a miscommunication. I pointed out to you back in season 1 that this happens all the time. She says something about her son, or seems to, and it turns out that she's talking about the actual son. There's a nice moment in this episode worth pointing out that goes back to our theme of this season, which is the way that myth and storytelling get used to build relationships and marriages and families. When Butterscotch and Beatrice are considering having the baby and running off together, they make that decision by telling a story. And it's a very traditional sitcom-like, novel-like story of proper family making. So he says, "Did you hear the story of the couple who moved to California? They hardly knew each other. And they tell this lovely little story of family building that sounds right out of a cheesy novel or a cheesy TV show. And by telling this story of the family, that is their way of making it a reality." Quite literally, right? That's what, it's by telling that story that they make the decision and come to the agreement. And she says back to him, "Isn't that how the story goes?" So the marriage is created on the basis of exactly this kind of myth making. This turns out to be the whole problem with their marriage, though, right? It's based on a story that itself is shaped on expectations that aren't ever going to happen, right? That's not the story that they're going to have. And given that their marriage is based on this thin fantasy, this thin projected story, it's especially impossible for them to have a satisfying marriage when it's nothing like their little story that they tell. I want to talk now about what I think is the deepest part of the whole episode. And this is what I've a major paper topic on for this season. And that is this final scene where Bojack finally has his chance to shake his mom into reality. She recognizes him, she sees who he is for a moment, and he has his chance to exact his revenge and bring her back to reality and tell her exactly everything she's done wrong. And instead, he gives her a fantasy. Right? He tells her that she's at the old Sugarman place and that everything is beautiful and that everyone loves her and that her family is there and that she's eating ice cream. He gives her this absolutely classic fantasy story. Why does he do that? He's been waiting the entire season to do the opposite of that, right? To finally get her to recognize him so that he can hold her accountable for the harm that she's done. Instead, at the moment that she recognizes him, he does the opposite. And here I want to bring in a concept from one of the readings I gave you. This is Hilda Lindemann's paper on holding in personhood. I think this is a really deep idea that she has. The idea here is that people always participate in helping us be who we are. And then when our agency is damaged, other people may need to do more work than usual to hold us in our personhood and in our identity, to help us be ourselves. So let me explain just a little bit, although you should get most of this from the reading. In a routine sense, even when we're not damaged, many of the identities that are nearest and dearest to us, many of the things that are most important to our sense of who we are things that we really can't be without the help and recognition of others, right? So I can't be a student unless there is a university and teachers who are giving me grades and a registrar who is signing me up and so on. There are all sorts of social relationships implicated in my being a student. I can't just be a student by myself in my home, right? I mean, I could do it online, but you understand what I mean. I need social support for it. I can't be a violinist if nobody listens to me play the violin. I can't be a friend. This is an important one, right? I can't be a friend unless somebody recognizes me as their friend back and participates in that relationship with me. I can't be a parent unless my child takes me as a parent. This is important because earlier we looked at the fact that biology alone isn't enough to make you into a family member, right? So in order to hold these various identities, we need to be embedded in social relationships and institutions in the right way, which means that other people need to help hold us in those identities by responding to us as somebody who has those identities and participating along with us. But the interesting point here is what happens when someone's grip on who they are starts to fade. And dementia is a great example of this, right? When people start to lose their memory and they start to lose their continuity, they lose their sense of self. But you can lose grip on who you are, not just because of dementia, but for example, because you're thrown into a situation where you everything is so alien to you that you can't keep a hold of it. Like, so arguably in Fish Out of Water, Bojack started to lose grip of who he was. But think about like if you've ever spent some time in the hospital, even if your memory isn't impaired, the hospital environment is so weird and alienating that you might not really feel like yourself there. You're out of all of your normal routines and you don't know how to behave, and people around you are treating you differently than you're used to being treated, and your body feels weird. You just don't feel like yourself. So there are all sorts of circumstances in which we lose a grip on our identity in this way. And dementia is one of the most powerful versions of that. And Lindemann's point is that when we start to lose a grip on our own identity like that, other people need to take up the slack and do more work to keep us in ourselves, to hold us in our identities. What does that mean? It doesn't mean co-opting or taking over our identity and telling us who we are, but it means doing small, practical, relational things for us that root us in social space and root us in our sense of who we are. So she gives examples like, if I have an elderly relative with dementia, I might try to hold him in his identity by feeding and caring for his pet, say, because I know that his pet is central to who he is, that his love of his pet is central to who he is, and that if his pet flourishes, that helps him flourish. Or buying somebody a record for their vinyl collection, which is something that you know that they'll love, which is a way of, as it were, reminding them what they like and who they are and what they care about, and showing that we still recognize the kind of person they are. Giving somebody a manicure or brushing their hair when they're in the hospital, that kind of help with self-care activity can help hold someone in their sense of who they are. So all of these activities of holding, Lindemann argues, are essential to maintaining selfhood and personhood when our personhood is impaired for some reason. In the old Sugarman Place episode, we saw that this kind of holding in personhood was exactly what Bojack's grandmother failed to get after she lost her son. Right? The death of her son, I argued this in the last lecture, the death of her son harmed her sense of self so much that she didn't know who she was anymore. And so she had a very impaired ability to hold herself in personhood. Her primary identity as a mother was taken away from her, and she didn't know what to put in its place. But instead of those people who are around her, particularly her husband, holding her in her personhood, they abandoned her. And he in particular abandoned her and actually lobotomized her instead, so that she truly couldn't be a person. So she was not held in personhood. And now Beatrice's grip on herself is slipping away. She's sliding back and forth between past and present, and her memory is going, her sense of reality is going. And the question is, will anyone hold her in personhood? But I think the deeper question, well, I don't want to say deeper, but the second layer of question, which Lindemann does not take up in her article, is, does holding Beatrice in personhood involve forcing her to understand the present reality she's in? And does it involve forcing her to understand her own past and the harm she's done? Or does holding her in personhood involve helping her to continue to live in a version of her past that's more tolerable to her, and where things make sense to her, and where she feels like she can survive? We see Hollyhock and Bojack have directly this conflict over how to treat her when it comes to the doll. When Bojack throws the doll out of his window, he's doing it under the guise of bringing her back to reality, connecting her to reality. Whereas Hollyhock tries to hold her in personhood precisely by letting her maintain this fantasy, right? And it's a fantasy in which her baby, her original doll was not torn away from her. And maybe it's a fantasy in which she did not tear Henrietta's baby away from her. We're not sure exactly what the fantasy is, but it's clearly disconnected from reality, right? So Hollyhock's version of holding her in personhood is different and involves a lot more fantasy. And we might say it involves deception. I think part of the question here is, which is really more real for her, right? Is her past more real or her present more real? It's not at all obvious that the present is actual reality for her at this point in her life. It may be that she's more capable of being in touch with the reality of the past than the present, in which case holding her in personhood may involve enabling her to live in the past. So at the very end there, when Bojack tells her that she's back at the old Sugarman Place, eating ice cream and surrounded by her family, what exactly is he doing? Is he holding her in personhood? Or is he lying to her and helping her build a false fantasy so that she'll be happier, but in a way that's making her more disconnected from who she really is? Because after all, Bojack is telling her that she's surrounded by loving family and eating ice cream, and that's not just her past, that's a fantasy past that never existed, right? She never had a loving family. That's a central fact about her character. And really importantly, she never got to eat ice cream. That was a central fact about her character too. Ice cream was the symbol for the fact that her father shamed her and disciplined her body and controlled her. Eating ice cream was not a thing she got to do. So Bojack's not just holding her in the past, he's holding her in a fake past. So you might think, well, yeah, he's making her feel better, but ultimately he's not doing right by her, right? He's lying to her and he's deceiving her. Or you might think he's giving her a version of reality that enables her to find some sort of self for herself that is tolerable, and hence he is holding her in personhood. And this raises other kinds of more general questions, like, is lying to somebody always wrong? In particular, is it always wrong to lie to somebody who will never be able to tell the difference between truth and deception again? Does that make lying better or worse? There's an interesting ethical question there, right? Does it still, maybe we should be more careful about not lying to people who don't have their own ability to tell truth from falsehood. Maybe they respect for them particularly involves helping them hold on to truth. Or maybe at that stage, truth no longer matters and reality no longer matters, and the more ethical thing is to lie to them if you need to in order to give them a sense of agency and self-understanding. As always, the show doesn't give us answers to these difficult questions, but it raises the questions very vividly. I also think it raises really acutely, and this is what I've asked you about in your paper prompt, the question of why Bojack would do this, right? Why does he suddenly become kind to her, if this is kindness, right? Because I just said, well, maybe lying to her is wrong, so it's not even clear it's kindness, but it's some sort of empathetic response to her that we didn't expect him to have. And there's an interesting question about why he suddenly has it at the moment, at that last moment. I'm particularly fascinated by the fact that in this last little speech, Bojack finally lets her eat ice cream, right? All her life, she's been waiting to be allowed to eat ice cream. And all her life, she's had this disordered relationship to eating and to her own body and to substance abuse. And all her life, she's been disciplined and told that she does not deserve ice cream, that it is not for her. It's become a symbol of this entire lifetime of denial and discipline. And at that last moment, Bojack gives her this incredible, it seems to me like a gift, right? He finally lets her eat the ice cream. She's been waiting her whole life to eat the ice cream. And so in some important sense, he has given her that agency, that freedom that she has been lacking her whole life in that moment, right? He lets her do this thing that she has been desiring to do just because she desires it. He frees her from other people's constraints. And that's like a really powerful kind of gift, isn't it? She gets to eat this ice cream at last. And she says, it's delicious. And I think there's a beautiful ambiguity here. What's delicious? Is the ice cream delicious? Is this entire experience she's having of being at the old Sugarman place and being surrounded by her family and seeing the beautiful lake, is that whole scene what's delicious? Or is it delicious to finally have her freedom in this final moment where she's locked in this drab room and she's in a wheelchair and she, in fact, like as far as the present goes, has no freedom at all. She can't move, she can't leave, she's totally under the care of others. She finally, through her fantasy past that Bojack gives her, gets her freedom and gets her agency. And maybe that's what's delicious. So back to the theme of time's arrow itself, right? When Bojack retells her past as one in which she had a loving family and gets to eat ice cream, of course he doesn't literally change the past. But in an important sense, he does change her past for real, right? Because the past for her is now something she can only access with help. She needs others to help her with her memories. And so because this is the only access to the past she has, he gets to tell her story in a different way. And for her, the past no longer exists except in her memory. So if that's the memory he gives her, then that's the past she has. So in that sense, he kind of is changing the past, right? I mean, ultimately, the past no longer exists by definition. That's what makes it the past. So the only past that exists for any of us is the past as it exists in our memory and experiences now. So if those experiences in that memory are altered, then there really is a sense in which our past, as we can access it, is also altered. And so this is another example of how time's arrow is not, in fact, as straight and unidirectional as Bojack says it is at the end of Old Sugarman Place. And I will stop there as far as time's arrow is concerned.